this is sort of a paradox, and it's something that I talk about periodically, and I think I'd like to dust this off and talk about it. So it's a great question. So in the old days, lots of people in America, in particular, they worked for themselves. They were self-employed, and they were farmers and what have you. They blacksmiths, etc., and they worked for themselves. And they had customers. The idea of the large employer came around later on with the Industrial Revolution, which was fueled by money printing, by dollar printing, counterfeiting, if you want to call it that. And where the idea was that you had one customer, your employer, that's it. So all of your labor went to one customer, which is your employer. Well, the problem with this is that anytime you have let's say that you own a business and you have one customer that makes up 25% or greater of your total volume, you are in danger. You are in great danger as a businessman. I talked to one guy one time. I told the story a long time ago, but I remember talking to somebody and he was telling me about his business and how great he was doing. And then he was telling me, and he said the name of the company, I'm not going to say the name because you'd know the name of the company immediately, was his largest customer. And he said, yeah, he says, they account for something like 40% of my volume. And I'm like, oh. In other words, you're doomed if that customer goes away. Or if that customer calls you up and says, hey, we want a lower price. What do you do? How do you handle that? Did you price in all of that? Because in most cases, most people don't. Most business owners, most entrepreneurs don't think that far forward. And the reason they don't think that far forward is because most of them don't have enough experience in entrepreneurship and business ownership. Most people don't have enough experience. Even people teaching a lot of these classes at Harvard and Yale, even those guys don't have enough experience in the real world to think that far out and realize what they're getting themselves into when you go to bed with some of these big box stores, these marts and box stores that start becoming, yeah, they're a great customer of yours. You're making a lot of money off them for now. And that's how it always works. Well, so to your point, where did that come from? That came from division of labor. Division of labor, the idea is that if one man goes out into the wilderness to survive, he has to rely on himself to do basically everything. You have to hunt food, you have to store food, you have to, keep yourself alive, while at the same time trying to maybe build a house and trying to build this and do that and avoid infection and avoid falling down and hurting yourself and on, like all these kinds of things. So division of labor is what's given us this bounty. And that's where this kind of comes from now. But division of labor, what we see now is a perversion, right? Like modern capitalism, if you want to call it that, is a perversion of old school commerce, wherein like the blacksmith in the town, was the blacksmith, and he had many customers, people who came to him to have their horses, shoed or something like that, you know what I mean? And so if one customer decided they didn't want to be his customer anymore, he didn't go into hock over that. Also, he usually owned the building he was in, he owned all his tools and equipment, he didn't have a bunch of debt. There's a point there. He owned all this stuff. There was a land and property ownership aspect that existed. I'm not trying to bore you with this, but I mean, like, for some people, this is like really foundational stuff that isn't talked about anywhere. Like, nobody teaches this stuff. But they had that. And so, therefore, working for themselves was very easy. The mega employer is a relatively recent thing in human evolution. Recent as in the last couple hundred years. And that's become a problem because eventually these companies, of course, they all require endless growth. They always require endless growth. And for my commie followers who say, see, it's all the fault of capitalism, that applies to government too. Governments require endless growth, always. It's anything big always requires endless growth. Anything. It doesn't make any difference if it's private or public, it doesn't matter. If it starts getting too big, the bureaucracy starts to take over, and then before you know it, you have people who don't exactly know what their job description actually even is anymore. They know that they do Zoom meetings and they fill out forms, but they don't even really know what the hell they're like. That's the problem with this kind of stuff. And so it creates the question where it's like, why are we doing all of this? And this is where a lot of people are at now. people, if in the English-speaking world, a lot of folks, and even other parts of the world, but I mean, like, I'm just talking to people who speak English because that's the language I'm speaking, are starting to question. Now, not boomers. Boomers, in many cases, sorry, many of them are just too far gone, and there's nothing that can be done for them. Some understand all this stuff. Others do not. They're too far gone. But people under 55 generally right now are starting to question all of this, going, well, what exactly are we doing with all of this? This is going to lead them, hopefully, back to trying to understand division of labor and where it came from and why it worked the way that it did. And when you finally come back to division of labor, you start to go, okay, well, then how do we keep score of all of that? Well, you keep score of all of that with something called money. Now, not the money that you're used to. Again, for my commie followers, you guys all freak out now and go, oh my God, it's all about the dollars. No, the dollar's a worthless currency that has no intrinsic or mathematical value of any kind. I've been very clear about that. That's my stated mission, is to bring down the dollar, by the way, and into the dustbin of history where it belongs. But money itself as a unit of measurement, now that's another matter entirely. And that's where we have to do that, because that's how you keep track of your division of labor, especially in a complex society. You can get away with the goodwill idea for a little while within a small civilization of people, but eventually that small civilization of people, you know how this works. Old Bob, who like always needs you to do something for him, and it's always a one-sided relationship, and eventually you just say, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore, right? Okay, so that's how that works in a small civilization. Well, in a large, complex civilization, that's very difficult to do. So this is enter the idea of keeping score. The difference is, if you're going to keep score with money, you have to have an accurate unit of measurement. You can't keep changing the units of measurement all the time, right? You can't keep changing the numbers around. If you keep changing the numbers around, in other words, you're changing the rules constantly. And what do we know about how that works when we're kids? We're kids on the playground, and you hear somebody shouts out, new rule, right? You're playing some kind of game, and then it's new rule, and eventually what happens is there's so many rules that nobody wants to play anymore because there's just too many rules. Well, that's now. There's too many rules, and the people who actually are productive don't want to play anymore. They're tired of it. So you have to get rid of you have to divest a bunch of these rules and get rid of them. And when you do that, then you have an honest currency, an honest money, well, that doesn't change, it stays the same no matter what, then it gets a lot easier to actually engage in commerce and be honest about it the entire time. Then you can be straightforward with everybody. So is that sort of that scan? Does that make sense? So it also means the end of the mega employer. Just so you know, I mean, for those of you out there like, well, but capitalism, blah, blah, blah. No, the mega employer can't exist without mega government. I've been very clear on this. And I think some of my commie followers, that you guys have selective hearing. Like, no, big government is what protects big business. Big banking funds all of it. Okay, these people are all in the same team. They're team oligarch. Okay, they're not on your side. I assure you, they're not on your side. But big government, we can vote for better people. No, you can't. You can't. People prove this over and over. You can't just vote better people. You can maybe vote for a good person once in a while here and there, and you might get lucky. But in most cases, if they come, especially if they come from the oligarch side, you're just going to get more of this, right? Because you're trying to fix a problem using the same people that created the problem, and that's just reality. You're not going to do that. You're not going to. It's the comic book thing, right? It's the we want Batman. We want the benevolent rich guy. We want the guy who comes from the oligarchs, but he somehow has this connection with the poor and the middle class. And that's just not reality. That's not how that works. I've overtaught this.